The Good Roads movement began in the late 1880s, and it was formed by a bunch of bicyclists. Bicycling became a craze in the late part of the 19th century here in the US and in Europe. And so these groups of bicyclists got together, the clubs, and started lobbying for good roads. And that became the Good Roads movement. Well, just in time for the automobile, at the late 1890s, they joined in. And it was very important for communities and states and even the US to have good surfaced roads. So in 1909, the editors of the New York Herald magazine and the Atlanta Journal got together, decided to create this national, what they called the National Highway from New York to Atlanta. Follows the Route of 29, a lot of it. And in 1909, they conceived of a Good Roads tour to promote this National Highway Drive, the Good Roads movement, and also to sell newspapers. You might have seen this postcard in Anderson. It was taken by Rufus Fant. It actually depicts the 1909 tour on the day that it came to Anderson for a lunch stop. Bob King, the owner of the Chicola Hotel, went on all three of the tours, the 9, 10, and the 11 Glidden tour. 350 people in about 70 cars went from New York to Atlanta, stopping along the way. The Pathfinder cars left New York and Atlanta, and before the tour, to meet halfway and take their notes and put them together. But those cars were called Pathfinders, common on all of these tours. The route went from New York through Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, West Virginia. Charlotte was a night stop, Greenville was a night stop, and then it stopped in Atlanta. So you can tell the difference between all of these tours by the banners on their hoods. And they had these banners. Well, as it turned out, Jacques Futrelle's grandson lived outside of Boston, and I contacted him. We stopped by, and they allowed me to take pictures of the actual banners that were on the grandfather's car. And this was Jacques and Lily Mae Futrelle in their 1908 Jackson. There it is, right there, car number 21. And there's 14 that we saw in Anderson. I don't know where this is on the route, but it's one of the press photos. But they also were given ribbons and medals. So you can see the little Concord, North Carolina pin. The tour started at New York Herald's newspaper office right there on Herald Square. There were press cars, there were official cars, there were trucks that carried parts and tires. Really cool with trams and horse-drawn overhead rail at Herald Square. October 25th of 1909 when they left. And they took a ferry at Perth Amboy. There's the Spartanburg entry. And there are lists in contemporary magazines of all the participants, all the cars, the winners, their scores. And that's what I spent time in the New York Public Library and the Detroit Public Library, pouring through those magazines, page by page. You have to do it. I mean, it's not like everything is online like people think. It's not. So the Anderson car was owned by a druggist named W.E. Atkinson, and it's a 1908 white steamer. Bob King rode along with him. He was an interesting character. He was a hotelier from this area, but went to St. Louis and then to Murray Hill, New York, and then wound up buying the Chicola Hotel. And that's how he made these contacts in those far-flung places, not only to participate on the tour, but also to have them come to his hotel in 1910 and 1911. So on the back of this, Atkinson's car, is this slogan, Anderson, South Carolina, the Lowell of the South. President Taft in late 1908 made a speech that referred to Anderson, at that time the Spindle City, the Lowell of the South, Lowell, Mass being a huge textile town. A lot of those factories and owners transferred their stuff down here to the upstate of South Carolina and North Georgia. Ty Cobb is piloting his brand new Chalmers Destroyer. Now remember, this is October of 1909, so the 1910 models would have been out. And this is a car that the Detroit Tigers gave him as a thank you for being the all-star player of 1909. Well, held all the records, and I don't think many of them have been beat. But everywhere he went, he was mobbed. He was probably the most famous person on the 1909 tour. That's June Cuneo and her husband, but she was very capable and was eventually banned because of her driving prowess. There were many ladies on the tour, not only wives, but also Joan had her entourage. Hers was one of the official press cars. Fashions of the day: dusters, goggles, hoods, rain gear. Not very flattering, but served the purpose. When the first tour was mentioned in 1909, it hit the telegraph and telephone lines like crazy. Everybody was excited. Every town wanted to get on the route because it meant income and recognition. So they all vied for inclusion on the route that was chosen. And everywhere they went, a lot of times it was the first time that people had seen more than one car, if even any car, especially when we're out in the country. But to see 50 of them go by in one day. The roads, basic dirt road, but there were banners, and cars would have banners extolling their company's virtues. Old steamroller and Joan Cuneo's Rainier number 8. And people just line up and watch them go by. Chain gangs needed them to build the roads. Welcome tourists. They were going through these scrappy little towns. The roads that connected them were just farm trails, farm to road market trails. And one thing about the towns forgot about these tours. One of them I think it's Tifton. Its courthouse burned, and all of the records and all of the newspaper stuff was there at their courthouse. And so along the route, it's just pretty much an unknown period of history that is definitely worth noting. You had to pass rivers and streams with or without bridges, so here they have a little horse-drawn ferry that goes across the river. We don't know where it is, but that's the Anderson team. And Bob King was known and photographed a lot, and also in newspaper cartoons, he had an umbrella festooned with dollar bills. So it obviously was good enough for cartoons in the newspapers as they went by. And if you were lucky, there was a one-lane bridge or a modern wooden covered bridge. So cotton bales and possums were really big decorations. you see possums up in the trees. And Oldsmobile Limited is one of the biggest cars of the era. It's huge. You can look it up, 1910 Oldsmobile Limited. And he actually has a little possum there on a leash. It must have been his mascot. There were different levels of accommodation on these tours. There was a lunch stop, which just meant a couple of hours diversion and lunch in a town. And then there were night stops that included a hotel and festivities and dinners. One of the night stops was in the Hotel Selwyn in Charlotte. That building is still there. It's now a government office. And then Greenville was a night stop, and then Anderson was just a lunch stop in '09. Gaffney, it's a little different driving through Gaffney now. The Hotel Otteray, now gone, had its Confederate monument in the center, and the cannons from the war. I showed this presentation to my car club in Charlotte, and one of the members said, "My grandfather owned the Otteray Hotel, and I grew up in it." It must have been nice having someone do your beds. Betty King Trowbridge told me the same thing. She grew up in the Plaza Hotel, and she never had to make a bed until she was married. And there's everybody walking around, blacks, whites, young, old. It was a really big deal for them, and it instilled civic pride when those groups came through. They victualled with us, they spent nights. On these tours, there weren't enough hotel rooms. Some of them had to stay in private residences, but there were plenty of people to accommodate them. If you go online and look, you'll see a lot of stuff about Good Roads tours and Glidden tours. And so much of it is wrong, because it's just been passed down, over time. Before there was Mercedes-Benz, there was Mercedes, Daimler, and they merged in 1926, but this is an actual Benz motor car by the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. At the conclusion of the tour, Ty Cobb and Joan Cuneo parked their cars in front of the Decatur City Hall. So there's Cobb and there's Cuneo. The whole idea of the tours was to prove the reliability of the automobile and to make it more available to non-rich people, because everybody thought that they were just toys of the wealthy. Between Cuneo and Ty Cobb, it really generated a lot of press, and once they got to Atlanta, they weren't done. Here's a picture of King with his "OU King" of Anderson. That's the Atlanta Journal too. So yeah, kids everywhere. Ty Cobb went, he was just mobbed. Piedmont Driving Club, which is still there, a very elegant meal for the automobilists and their mechanicians. There was a whole different set of jargon back then. Automobilists and mechanician was the guy that rode along with him, like a co-pilot. So not only when they got to Atlanta, they had the first national automobile show in Atlanta, the first in the South, that week that when they arrived in November. But they also inaugurated the Atlanta Speedway, which is now where the airport is, Hartsfield International. Clubhouse for the AAA in Hapeville, next to the Speedway. Lunch at the Speedway. So for 1910, they reversed the route and went from Atlanta to Herald Square in New York City. Covered 1,000 miles from June 6th to the 14th. 69 contestants entered, 55 finished. Notables on that tour were Asa Candler Jr., Candler Park, and Candler Coca-Cola money, and Bob King, naturally, of the Chicola Hotel. One of the Pathfinders was a Columbia automobile made in New York. And again, that's the roads that we had between towns. And that's why we needed a good roads movement and action from state and local and federal officials. So the Mercer Automobile Company was formed in Trenton, New Jersey in late 1909. We've all heard about Mercer Sportabouts, and Bob King obviously became acquainted with the family, and in 1910 he rode in this Mercer that was one of the earliest production cars of the Mercer Automobile Company. That was owned by the Roeblings, who also built the Brooklyn Bridge. This was at a starting lineup, and the guy there is checking that everybody's there and giving them a time to start. And it wasn't really like a rally, like a race. It was more just a day's tour, and you scored for points. But still, everybody was happy to see them. They did turn out. Again, the Selwyn Hotel in 1910 was an overnight stop. But for this tour in 1910, they spent the night at the Chicola. And they had such a good time that Bob King convinced them to come back the next year for the 11 Glidden tour. Rutted roads, rain, that's what they had to suffer through. Flat tires. They had service vehicles along with them, but not like AAA and sending a tow truck. Because Mr. King was in all of these tours and the photographers took copious photographs, they could order them after the fact, and that's what he did, and that's how they wound up in that album. This is one of the most dramatic pictures I think that have ever seen of that style and time. It's the 1910 Mercer Toy Tonneau. Toy Tonneau is just a body style. Dirty, muddy, nasty. The guy's got a broom. But it's such a dramatic photo. So finally they reached New York. Big city, big lineup. And they would have festive banquets with the awards being presented and press and tradesmen, and it was a lot of ballyhoo.